So today, I'd like to talk to you about what I call public risk management. I came up with using that term to avoid the much more scary term regulation. So today's topic is going to be talking about public risk management for AI, the path forward, and I'm actually going to discuss quite a bit why I don't think traditional regulation is going to work and why I'm optimistic that that's okay and that we're going to be able to manage the risks associated with AI without the need for direct government intervention. So let's jump right into it. What is a public risk? Well, public risk is a term coined by Peter Huber in the 1980s that I think, in an article that I think I'm the only person who read. But it really struck a chord with me. It refers to potential sources of harm that are centrally or mass-produced or widely distributed and that are largely outside the control of the individual risk bearer. So what does that mean in plain English? A public risk is something that could potentially harm a lot of people, but the individual potential victims have no way of stopping the harm from happening. So examples of public risks that you all would be familiar with include nuclear technology, mass-produced consumer goods and environmental threats, and mechanized transportation. These are all things that meet those criteria above. And I think that many autonomous systems are going to share those same features. Autonomous systems are becoming increasingly ubiquitous in our lives, but they are technologies that most people who use them are not going to have a hand in their creation and are not going to really be able to control the safety aspects of them unless they are well designed so that they can do so. So, as you might have noticed from that list of different forms of public risks didn't really exist prior to industrialization, at least of the human-generated variety. So this is a relatively recent phenomenon, the concept of public risk. So the modern forms of public risk management, what we think of as regulation, were developed in response to and because the fact that pre-industrial institutions proved to be fundamentally incapable of managing the risks and harms generated by industrialization. And there's a number of social and economic reasons for that, but I think that everybody can agree that by and large, in the industrial era, there was a great centralization of production of different goods and services that people use. And that centralization meant that, unlike back in the day when your shoes were made by the local cobbler and your toys were made in your house, they were made by people thousands or hundreds of miles away, and you had no way of making sure that what they were doing when they were making that shoe and when they were making that toy was safe. So what we ended up developing are a number of different forms of risk management, and I've kind of created two axes here to categorize them. There's formal and informal methods of risk management, and you could also call those governmental and non-governmental, and then preemptive and reactive. And you could also think of those as ex ante and ex post, or immediate things that take immediate effect and those things that take time to kind of develop. And usually when people think of regulation, they think of the top two things in the top left corner, legislation and agency regulation. I'm going to spend today talking about the different things on this chart and why it's generally, I think that it's going to be challenging for these forms of risk management to manage the risks associated with AI. The one thing we're not going to talk about further that's on this list is subsidies. And that's both because that is a not very coercive and not very direct method of managing the risk associated with technology. And also because I don't get the impression that in the world of artificial intelligence, a lack of investment money is going to be a serious drawback. So we're going to focus on the remaining things on this list. And the big question for AI risk management is whether these industrial era methods of risk management are going to be capable of managing the risks associated with artificial intelligence and autonomous machines. So let's talk about why it's going to be challenging for these various forms of risk management. First, with the shortcomings of traditional formal regulation. So that would be the legislation and agency regulations, the things that were in that top left box in the table that I showed you. Well, one reason is that machines are not people. That's important because all existing legal systems operate by assigning and allocating legal rights and responsibilities to persons, either natural persons or corporate persons. Corporate persons are the only widely accepted form of person that is not a human being. Unlike previous generations of technology, autonomous systems are going to be autonomous. And that kind of creates a unique challenge for the legal system because they're not used to autonomous agents that aren't people, that are potentially causing harm. There are other aspects of of AI that I think is going to make it difficult to manage the risks associated with them through traditional regulation. And largely, these remaining ones have to do with the way in which research and development work in AI can be done. And as you'll see, they're also shared by other information age technologies. And there's 4 of them that I want to talk about. And the first is discreteness, spelled with an EET. And that refers to the fact that risky development work could be done in locations and using methods that escape detection by regulators. As you might have noticed, those examples of public risks that were on the first slide that I showed you, it's hard to do nuclear technology research, and it is hard to mass produce consumer goods without leaving a large physical footprint of some kind, or other traces and footprints in the sand that regulators can use to figure out where the harm is coming from and who is responsible for generating it. That's not necessarily going to be the case with artificial intelligence, as with other information age technologies. You can do work on an artificial intelligence system without leaving a large physical footprint, without large visible infrastructure in place. There's also a discreteness with an ETE problem. And this form of discreteness refers to the fact that the risk might stem from the interaction of components that are created at different times and places without conscious coordination. Think of the machine learning libraries on GitHub. If those get incorporated into a system, it's kind of hard to say that there was one person who was responsible for designing that machine learning library, and it's even more difficult to say, you can't even necessarily hold them collectively responsible because they may not have coordinated with one another in any sort of conscious way. Commits to GitHub can obviously be made without the person who makes one commit having checked with the person who made the previous commit to see if they're okay with it. So the next issue is diffuseness. This is closely related to that last issue of discreteness. And that refers to the fact that designers and manufacturers of components and the people who have input into coding may be in different jurisdictions, and the operators of the technologies might end up being in yet other jurisdictions. The last issue is opacity. And that's exactly what it sounds like. And that simply means that regulators may not be able to discover or understand the underlying mechanisms that create the risk. So these problems are what led me to question the ability of traditional formal regulation to manage the risks associated with AI. Well, why can't we just leave it to the free market? Why not just let consumers go and buy AI products, and then those that end up killing members of their family don't get purchased again in the future? Well, there's a few problems with that, and as you'll see, these are issues that are not at all a new phenomenon as far as challenges for free market risk management. One is information asymmetry, and I place a lot of weight on this one personally. Producers have more information about the potential sources of risk in their products than consumers do. I have a feeling that this is going to be particularly acute with AI, just as it is for other emerging technologies. When a technology is new, usually the people who are creating that technology and the innovators are the only people who are going to have a full, proper understanding of how it works. So, and certainly consumers who have not interacted with that technology before are not going to have a proper understanding of the underlying mechanisms by which it works that allows them to assess the risk associated with it. So that information asymmetry, that's a failure in the free market that results from Failures in the free market that resulted from information asymmetry are a large part of why the regulatory state was developed. It was meant to be some great equalizer that allowed consumers to be protected because there were particular government agencies and institutions that did have the knowledge about the public risks and that were able to develop rules that were able to manage those risks, even if the individual potential victims didn't have a full understanding. So what about insurance? This is something that I've struggled with a little bit. I think that certainly insurance offers some promise as a method of risk management for AI. But the problem is that it's difficult to estimate risks associated with new technologies. You usually have to have a track record in order to accurately assess what the risks are. And it's difficult to insure against large-scale public risks. Obviously, if the 3 Mile Island nuclear almost meltdown had actually developed into a full meltdown, whatever insurance companies were involved in that would have had a very difficult time meeting their obligations. And that's true in many cases for a wide variety of public risks. And that's why insurance is generally not an adequate method of managing the risks associated with public risks. So what about industry standards and self-regulation? I actually think, I used to be quite skeptical of industry standards as an effective form of risk management for the reasons that I talk about on this slide. But then I'm going to move into why I think that there is actually some very good reasons to believe that industry standards could be an effective form of risk management for AI. So what are the traditional shortcomings? Well, the first is the fox guarding the hen house problem. Industry effectively decides the acceptable level of risk for the public when dealing with industry standards. That only works if the industry's interests are largely aligned with those of society at large. And that is rarely the case for large companies, which traditionally generate most public risks. Another issue is enforcement. Market participants can avoid the restrictions imposed by industry standards simply by leaving the rulemaking body that sets those standards or by never joining that body in the first place. And so what you usually end up with self-regulation is one of two outcomes. You either have weak and ineffective standards, or you have strong standards that are never enforced. Well, could it be different with AI? Here's the reasons that I am optimistic that industry standards could actually be effective in the case of AI. First is that we've seen early buy-in from key industry players. Industry's not waiting for the harm to occur before making the move and assessing the risks associated with autonomous systems. That's pretty unusual for new technologies. Usually producers don't want to go out ahead and create the perception that there might be risks associated with their technologies by preemptively discussing the safety aspects and the safety challenges that it presents. We're seeing a level of awareness of that with AI that you haven't seen with earlier generations of public risks. And this is reflected in private sector initiatives encouraging transparency and beneficial AI, such as the Partnership on AI, the OpenAI project, and we also have broad stakeholder participation in these initiatives. And the AI community has so far been very welcoming of input from policy, ethics, and legal experts. And those stakeholders are often having a direct role in those current initiatives that are underway. That means that the industry standards that could be developed might align better with those of society at large than traditionally is the case with industry standards and self-regulation. And also, there's an emerging consensus around the goals of what we want to see as far as beneficial artificial intelligence. And that was beautifully reflected with the survey results yesterday. So, there's an additional reason that I'm optimistic, though. Those things by themselves would be good, but when industry standards have a strong degree of consensus, they can be amplified by the common law. And I'm going to try to summarize what the common law is in about 15 seconds, and that's not easy. But the common law is a system where legal rules don't come from fixed legislation, but instead develop organically from precedents derived from the resolution of individual disputes. So if in one dispute they say you have to clean up a spill on aisle 4 within 10 minutes, and if you don't, you're negligent, then the next court that comes along is going to look at that prior case and say, well, you didn't clean up that spill on aisle 4 within 10 minutes, so you were negligent. And what this allows is kind of a slow development of legal rules about what behavior is acceptable and what behavior is not. This is the dominant legal system in the English-speaking world, and elements of the common law are becoming increasingly prevalent in a number of other countries. And the key mechanism for the purposes of risk management with emerging technologies is tort law. Tort law is a broad area of the law, and one feature of it is that all people have a duty of care to avoid causing harm when they're engaging in activities that could potentially lead to harm. When true industry consensus emerges, and that consensus is reflected in written standards, those standards can effectively become the law through the adoption by common law courts as part of that duty of care to avoid causing harm. That hasn't happened as often as it, I think, should have over the course of the industrial era, in part because that industry consensus is very hard to achieve and it rarely emerges early enough for it to be incorporated before legislation and agency regulation preempts the field. I want to talk a little bit about some current developments that are going on that are also specifically giving me hope that there's actually movement happening with industry standards that could lead to effective risk management for AI. A lot of them are happening at the IEEE. The IEEE has a global initiative for ethical considerations in AI and autonomous systems. It's an initiative that is divided into committees focusing on different aspects of ensuring ethically aligned design. They produced a draft version of basically the goals and potential standards that the initiative could lead to last month, and that is currently in the public comment period. Hint, hint, this is the time to engage and provide input on what ethically aligned design should look like for AI. A sample standard that I want to talk about, there's certainly a lot of standards that could potentially come out of this initiative, but one that is currently underway is transparency in autonomous systems. That's a goal that, while there's some controversy, that seems to be a large amount of interest in transparency in AI, and this is a standard that is going to encourage transparency to a wide range of stakeholders. And it recognizes that transparency is going to mean different things for and different things to different groups of stakeholders, and I listed some of the stakeholders that are in mind in the previous paragraph there, the previous bullet point. Now, I think that there is a general consensus, as I said, that openness is good, but being a lawyer and a former law clerk for a judge, I can't resist noting, for the purposes of fairness, the potential shortcomings of openness, and that is, one is intellectual property concerns. The usual industry standards way of getting around that is to have licensing under fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory terms. That isn't so useful if the tech can easily be pirated. Another is security concerns. Openness could give bad actors a blueprint on how to do harm. Other current developments, there are a couple of things, and I'll just go through these quickly. Two of them are being spearheaded by Wendell Wallach, and they are essentially governance coordinating committees, which is a proposal that he and Gary Marchant made a couple of years ago. It's an institutional mechanism for coordinating risk management efforts, and there is a national initiative that is currently underway, and Wendell has just spearheaded more recently an international effort in coordinating with the Hastings Center and the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, seeking to act as an issues manager for institutional stakeholders worldwide. We're also seeing a number of sector-specific initiatives in areas such as autonomous weapons and autonomous vehicles. So in closing, the momentum that is being generated by this conference and others like it must not only be sustained but intensified. We can't stop with general statements of principles. We have to be concrete about the goals that we want to achieve, and we have to be concrete about what it means to have safe and beneficial AI. This is a rare opportunity here to shape policy without going to a government for approval. So the bottom line is, I think it's easy to lose sight at these conferences of what a rare opportunity there is here. This is the most important invention, arguably, in the history of mankind. And the people in this room have the ability to shape the way that policy develops for that technology. That's once in more than a generation. That's once in multiple lifetimes opportunity. So don't fear law, policy, and ethics people. Engage them and engage with each other.
That was a great overview, Matt. Thanks very much. One thing you didn't touch on was the dynamic with society in general. And you know we've learned over the last 15, 20 years that the social dynamics, social trust, social accountability are critical in terms of creating barriers for technology innovation or enabling it. You just say a little bit about how you see that aspect of things around engagement, trust, and accountability fitting in with your governance ideas.
Well, one thing that we do have to bear in mind at these conferences is that we are, to a certain degree, breathing rarefied air. You know, the broader, the man on the street, as it were, the people who, say, elected Trump as president are not in this room, by and large. And we need to bear that in mind when we're thinking about how society is going to react to the standards that we have. And so I guess I should have added to my talk and say we shouldn't just engage with each other and with the policy experts that are in this room. We should seek out and make sure that we're hearing the concerns of people who we ordinarily wouldn't even think of inviting to conferences like this. And if we don't do that, then there's a very real risk that whatever standards we develop are going to eventually be rejected by the legal system. Because in democracies, if people don't like the way that an industry is regulating itself, they create pressure for the government to regulate it for them.
Yes. As Vadi, yeah.
We talk about AI systems, autonomous AI systems. This is something that will happen sometimes maybe in the near future, but hasn't happened yet. But there are two autonomous AI systems already being deployed, and it's the Google search rank algorithm and the Facebook news rank algorithm. These are hugely influential algorithms. And so I have a hard time being so optimistic about the self-regulation where the things are already deployed have escaped so far any regulation whatsoever, including any industry regulation.
I understand the reasons to be skeptical of the effectiveness of this sort of thing. But I really do think it is still early days, and there's still plenty of space and time for us to develop standards that can ensure the beneficence of AI.
Yes, thank you. There's a question there. This may be the last question. Okay.
Vince Conitzer, Duke University. So a little while ago, some of our law students participated in this mock trial about autonomous vehicles. And some of this came down to which information would personally identify you. So they were talking about this very sensibly, but as it turned out, they hadn't actually thought of the fact that trajectory information would personally identify you. And so my question is, do you think we're doing enough to train young lawyers, not just in sort of the abstract concepts involving this, but also just concrete technical aspects that would allow you to answer such questions?
No, I don't think that we're doing enough for that. And it's difficult to get law schools to teach law students about practical things to begin with, and I think that that's especially challenging with new technologies. And I completely agree. That's something that there should be more awareness raised in law schools, that these legal issues are things that law students should be examining now, because they're the ones who are going to be both help shaping the policy in the future and representing clients in individual cases where they're at issue.
Yes.